From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
You met with Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld.
Special briefing on Thursday, very interesting, a lot of good information, especially about post-Saddam, post-regime time. What are we going to do then? It's a very well laid out plan.
Pentagon's pundits. Today, New York Times reporter David Barstow, he's just been awarded the 2009 Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting for exposing the Defense Department's propaganda campaign to recruit more than 75 retired military officers to appear on TV outlets as military analysts ahead of and during the Iraq War. This week, the Pentagon admitted its internal review of the program was flawed and withdrew it. This is David Barstow's first national broadcast television interview. Then, Mother's Day.
Mother's Day really was, in its origin, an anti-war day, an anti-war statement.
We'll play a dramatic reading of Julia Wardhouse's Mother's Day proclamation and speak with Susan Gallimore, author of Long Time Passing. Mothers Speak About War and Terror. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Pentagon's given its first acknowledgement Afghan civilians were killed by U.S. bombs earlier this week. The toll from Monday's bombing in Farah province remains unknown, with estimates topping 100 civilians, including many women and children. On Thursday, a Pentagon official admitted to the New York Times initial U.S. claims of Taliban grenades causing the deaths were, quote, thinly sourced. Local residents have said the damage was far too extensive for any Taliban weapon to cause. On Thursday, hundreds of Farah residents protested outside the provincial governor's office, demanding the withdrawal of all foreign troops. 3 demonstrators were wounded after Afghan police officers opened fire. The House Appropriations Committee, meanwhile, has approved a nearly $97 billion spending bill funding the occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan. The measure was stripped of a more than $80 million Obama administration request to close the U.S. prison camp at Guantanamo. For the first time, the cost of occupying Afghanistan will surpass the total spent on occupying Iraq next year. In addition to more than $500 billion for the Pentagon, the Obama administration is seeking $65 billion for occupying Afghanistan, compared to $61 billion for Iraq. In Pakistan, the UN's estimating some 500,000 civilians have now fled clashes between government forces and Taliban fighters in Swat Valley. Both sides have declared an end to the 3-month truce that allowed the Taliban to impose Islamic law. On Thursday, Pakistani Prime Minister Yusuf Raza Gilani announced a major offensive against Taliban fighters.
After due deliberations and consultations with all concerned, the government has decided to take the following actions. In order to restore honor and dignity of our homeland and to protect our people, the armed forces have been called in to eliminate the militants and terrorists.
Aid officials say the escalated fighting could bring about a major humanitarian crisis in the Swat Valley. A former U.S. soldier has been convicted for the 2006 rape and murder of an Iraqi teenager and the killing of her family. On Thursday, a federal jury found Stephen Green guilty on all 17 counts. Prosecutors say Green was the ringleader in raping and killing 14-year-old Abir Qasim Hamza al-Janabi and killing her parents and 5-year-old sister. 3 soldiers have already been sentenced to life in prison in the case. In Iraq, the Baghdad contract of the private military firm once known as Blackwater has officially expired. The company, now calling itself Z, that's XE, will continue to work elsewhere in Iraq. The firm Triple Canopy is taking over for Blackwater in Baghdad and is widely expected to rehire many of its guards. The Iraqi government refused to renew Blackwater's license following the 2007 mass killing of 17 Iraqis in Baghdad's Nisour Square. 5 Blackwater guards face charges for the attack. In a new development in that case, 2 government informants are claiming Blackwater operatives gave their weapons to another contractor now charged with smuggling them out of Iraq. The informants say the Blackwater guards wanted to get rid of the weapons before they were investigated for the Nisour massacre. The Federal Reserve has determined the nation's top banks could lose nearly $600 billion by the end of next year. The warning came out of the government's stress test assessing the bank's viability. The Fed has ordered 10 banks to raise a combined $74.6 billion in capital to protect themselves against collapse. Of all the banks, the government says only GMAC, the financial arm of General Motors, is likely to need additional taxpayer aid. President Obama's unveiled a budget plan that would save $17 billion by cutting some 121 programs. Obama called the cuts a necessary step to avoid leaving crippling debt to future generations.
We can no longer afford to spend as if deficits don't matter and waste is not our problem. We can no longer afford to leave the hard choices for the next budget, the next administration, or the next generation. We will also continue to look for ways we can save taxpayer money. And I know there are many in both parties in Congress committed to cutting spending and eager to work with us.
The Obama budget includes a 4% increase in military spending. The Pentagon would also see more cuts than any other department, totaling $8.8 billion from 14 programs. Health advocates are criticizing a budget item that would reverse an Obama campaign pledge to combat the spread of HIV and AIDS by lifting the federal ban on needle exchange programs. The Obama budget includes language that bans any federal spending on needle exchange. The chair of the New York Federal Reserve has resigned amid scrutiny over his financial ties to the bailed-out firm Goldman Sachs. Earlier this week, the Wall Street Journal revealed Stephen Friedman was given a waiver to hold shares in Goldman Sachs even after it became a regulated bank-holding firm. A former Goldman Sachs executive, Friedman was also found to have bought the shares even before he was granted the legal waiver. The shares are now estimated to be worth more than $2 million. Newly released documents show House Speaker Nancy Pelosi was briefed on the Bush administration's torture of foreign prisoners in September of 2002. The disclosure apparently contradicts Pelosi's claim she was never given details on what techniques were used. Intelligence records show Pelosi and then House Intelligence Committee Chair Puerto were briefed on the interrogation of suspected al-Qaeda operative Abu Zubaydah, who was waterboarded at least 80 times. Pelosi says she was never told the waterboarding was used. The group Physicians for Human Rights is calling for an independent investigation of the role of the American Psychological Association in the U.S. torture of foreign prisoners. The APA has come under wide scrutiny for allowing psychologists to oversee abusive and coercive interrogations of prisoners at Guantanamo and secret CIA black sites. Physicians for Human Rights says newly released documents show the APA's ethics task force altered its policy to conform with Pentagon guidelines on interrogations. In Burma, the military junta has detained a U.S. citizen who apparently swam across a lake to reach the home of the confined pro-democracy leader Aung San Suu Kyi. The junta says John William Yitaw spent 2 days in Suu Kyi's home before he was captured as he made his way out. Suu Kyi has spent 13 of the last 19 years under house arrest. In Peru, the jailed American activist Lori Berenson has given birth to a baby boy. Berenson has spent nearly 14 years in prison after hooded Peruvian military judges convicted her of collaborating with the rebel group MRTA. She's eligible for conditional release in November of 2010. Obama administration officials were in Syria Thursday for meetings with Syria's foreign minister. Jeffrey Feltman of the State Department said the U.S. is seeking to forge new diplomatic ties with Syria.
We came here today as part of President Obama's commitment to use diplomacy, to use dialogue, in order to try to see where we can move forward, where our interests overlap, and to see where we can try to work together to bridge the differences.
In Washington, D.C., 6 Puerto Rican activists were arrested Wednesday for staging a pro-independence demonstration inside the House. The group held up signs in the visitors' area overlooking the House floor. A new report says more than 17% of children younger than 5 are at risk of hunger in the United States. According to Feeding America, the figure means 3.5 million children could suffer cognitive and developmental damage resulting from not being properly fed. Here in New York, a group of protesters rallied outside Governor David Paterson's Midtown office Thursday to protest the treatment of mentally ill prisoners. Last week, Rikers Island prisoner Clarence Mobley died after a physical altercation with prison guards. He'd been awaiting psychiatric evaluation. The group Rights for Imprisoned People with Psychiatric Disabilities has likened the treatment of mentally ill prisoners to torture that's driven some to suicide and declining mental health. And in campus news, the embattled new school president, Bob Kerrey, has announced he'll step down when his contract expires in 2011. Kerrey has been the target of a series of student protests on issues ranging from his alleged involvement in war crimes as a soldier in Vietnam, his record as a Republican senator, and his running of the new school. Kerrey received a no-confidence vote from the new school faculty last year. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report.